Hello, this is Ralph Alvarado, and welcome to Exploratory Text Analytics. In this video, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Paul Ricoeur, some background information to the essay I've asked you to read by Paul Ricoeur. The Ricoeur reading I've added to this syllabus because it really provides, it's a stand-in for the general field of hermeneutics, which I think is really important as an area of domain knowledge for exploratory text analytics. Recall that hermeneutics, I'll explain this in a second, is the study of the interpretation of text, which I mentioned in the first video, or in an earlier video. This reading is important because it provides a general theory of the structure and function of texts. And by structure, I mean the way that texts are shaped by there being a kind of discourse and a form of what is called locution that is fixed and distantiated by writing. And we'll go over what those terms mean in the video following this one. By function, we really want to look at text in terms of their most important function, which is that they enable the existence of society, as well as the study of society in societies that are text-based. This is really important. We tend to take texts for granted. We tend to see them as convenient vehicles for communicating information, but we imagine that we can get on without them. And indeed, human beings can get on without texts, but to do so is to imagine a completely different kind of society and a completely different kind of culture. Cultures and societies are highly dependent on their modes of communication, and text, in particular the kind of text that we're talking about, say novels and newspapers and things like that, are very historically specific and very tied into certain forms of social organization and cultural forms. In fact, we can think of texts and data as two competing forms of cultural representation and of cultural memory. We're entering a phase, we have been in some time historically, a phase where text has been demoted from being the primary means of communication and supplanted by mass media such as television and radio and the internet, which, by the way, is very textual in many aspects. But there's another player in this space now, and that's data, and it's one of the reasons why data science exists. It's helpful to think of text being as important as data, as this form of representation on which so much depends in a society. So I call this Guide for the Perplexed. Ricoeur's writing, if you're reading it for the first time, if you're encountering this kind of writing for the first time, you're going to find it possibly a bit hard to read if you're not familiar with philosophical writing. And one of the reasons that it is difficult is because it uses a lot of special keywords, many of them in German. And it cites a lot of thinkers and ideas you may never have heard of or read. This is because Western philosophy, the tradition of philosophy, in particular, what's called continental philosophy, of which Ricoeur is a member. Continental just means from Europe, from the continent of Europe. He's a French philosopher, and therefore he's part of this tradition that really intentionally builds on the ideas of others. You don't simply cite other ideas. You're almost like extending this bridge, this artifice, this long dialogue that goes back to Plato, and literally going back to Plato in the sense that philosophers frequently hearken back to Plato and Greek philosophy and everything in between. And you're kind of expected to know this body of knowledge when you read a text like this. And obviously, you get some of that in your college or high school education, which helps. But sometimes it's very specialized, and in this case, there are some thinkers mentioned that I'm sure most of you haven't read. So this video is going to provide some background information to help you understand the text, which, by the way, is a quintessential hermeneutic task. The first thing I want to explain is what hermeneutics is. A little more detail here. Hermeneutics can be defined as the theory and practice of interpreting written documents in our culture. Its lexical root is the Greek god Hermes, who was a messenger, and this is the same deity that the Romans called Mercury. And the need to have hermeneutics, the need to develop a theory of interpretation in the West, and this has actually happened in other cultures as well, develops from the need to interpret things like Roman law or the Bible, since these documents have become so important to society and yet so distant from the modern mind. And so what happens is that hermeneutics emerges, I guess you could pinpoint it to the late 18th century, when there was a real concern with making sense of the Bible, the ongoing Protestant Reformation and so forth, brought to bear these hermeneutic methods to try to make sense of texts that had clearly been written at a different time with a different sense of what is socially real and things like that. Another important point about hermeneutics is because of the fundamental role of language and text in society and culture, the idea of interpretation, of just interpreting text, has been used to distinguish the natural from the human sciences. This has been seen as one of the main dividing lines between what humanists do and what scientists do. So natural science is conceived of in this distinction as being focused on the explanation of natural phenomena using techniques like mathematics and so forth, whereas the human sciences are related to understanding human behavior and human action, which is represented primarily through text. So if you think about the human sciences and the natural sciences based on what kind of information they're based on, what their primary source of information is, you'll see very quickly that the humanities sees as their primary source language and text, whereas these natural sciences see as their primary source natural phenomena, signals from nature, observations that come directly from nature and that are unmediated by language. They may be mediated by instruments, but they're not mediated by human language, whereas there's no getting around human language with the human sciences in this conception. And therefore you have this distinction between explanation and understanding that Ricoeur refers to. Another key point is that hermeneutics is German. The person I was thinking of when I said hermeneutics was developed in the late 18th century is a theologian named Schleiermacher, who of course is German. And during that period, a lot of German thought goes toward developing a fully fledged philosophy and framework for thinking about this distinction between the human sciences and the natural sciences. And here are some terms that you'll see thrown about the text in italics that you're kind of expected to know. The first one is Wissenschaft, which just simply means knowledge or science, but science broadly conceived. Second is Geist, which is an interesting, wonderful German word that is really hard to translate into English because it covers a wide semantic range, everything from spirit and mind to intellect. And it literally means ghost, and it's actually related to the English word ghost. And so given those two words, you have this compound word, Geisteswissenschaft, which refers to the human sciences, and Naturwissenschaft, which refers to the natural sciences. So nature is the same in English and German, roughly. Another important concept is Verstehen. And by the way, please excuse my German pronunciation. I do not speak German. I try to pronounce accurately, but I'm certainly getting it wrong. But the concept or the term Verstehen refers to understanding, comprehension, even empathy. It's a very human way of knowing that's super important in a hermeneutic understanding of the human sciences. There's Auslegung, which means interpretation or exegesis, the act of interpreting itself. There's Erklären, which means explanation, the use of logic, and this is this opposition between explanation and understanding referenced earlier. There's the notion of Welt and Umwelt. So Welt is the whole world, with the same kind of connotations as the English world being, the whole world as a planet, but also sort of the mental world in which you inhabit. But there's Umwelt, which is a little more concrete, which refers to your environment, your surroundings, your situation, your setting. There's this notion of interpretive social science that Ricoeur is building on as well, that is associated with the work of Wilhelm Dilthey, who's a 19th century German philosopher who took the concept of hermeneutics and generalized it to a great degree to apply, to be really the entire framework for sociology. The idea is that, the sociologist is not simply interested in understanding society per se, as, how people organize and so forth into institutions, but human behavior itself. And human behavior in this view is heavily mediated by Verstehen, by understanding, which is divided into the two broad categories of ethos and worldview. This debate continues today about, what is the relative role of Verstehen, or human understanding of the world, with respect to their behavior. There are, school of thought which wants to discount the role of culture in human behavior, and there's a school of thought which wants to attribute culture a very strong, non-dependent role in determining human behavior. So, just to give you one example, in neoclassical economics, you've had for a long time this notion of the rational actor, who acts independently of culture, in the sense that, it's not beliefs and opinions that influence his or her behavior, but a rational calculation of interest and the expectation of return on value for certain activities and so forth. That has been challenged recently by behavioral economics, which in a variety of ways has shown what it considers to be biases in human behavior. These biases are, in fact, cultural forms and based on people's understandings of the world, which are quote unquote not rational in this narrow sense of rationality. So, very important, in this view, human beings are said to inhabit worlds and not just situations. That's a really important distinction. When you're looking at animal behavior, and indeed certain kinds of human behavior, it's sufficient to consider the environment within which the organism behaves, the immediate physical environment, with perhaps some memory contributing to behavior. But with human beings, it's very clear that a big part of what motivates human beings to act is how they conceptualize the world, how they imagine the entire universe to be, for example, whether they consider it to be governed by fate or by malevolence, or whether there are gods, or whether there is a God, whether there's judgment, providence, karma, things of that nature, are said to influence human behavior in non-trivial ways. And so it's important to understand that in this framework, human beings are actors. They act through something that is called meaningful action, as opposed to merely behaving. Of course, the most extreme case of taking the latter view, that humans are essentially behavioristic in the sense that they respond to environmental cues and so forth, is behaviorism. And behaviorism is not really friendly toward an understanding of text, because a text, the value of a text is that it contains clues and information about people's understandings of the world. And we'll go into how Ricoeur talks about that.